Hello, this is a new set of videos I'm making on the topic of the Universal House of Justice and the Baha'i world during the first decade of its existence, from 1963 to 1973. It's based on one of my old manuscripts. The main topics covered will include, by way of context, the World Crusade, Shoghi Effendi's passing and the absence of a will, the hands of the cause custodianship, and the success of the World Crusade. Then we'll talk about the election of the House of Justice, delineating the work and powers of the Universal House of Justice and its relationship to the guardianship, then the hands of the cause and related institutions, and then the first 9-year plan from 1964 to 73, a campaign of worldwide expansion and consolidation. Then we'll talk about teaching, consolidation and deepening, proclamation, international conferences and temples, the role of the individual and the appeal to youth, law and administration, developments at the Baha'i World Center in the Haifa-Akka region, the Baha'i shrines and gardens, work on the Baha'i texts, external relations. In terms of sources, the major one is the book of the messages from the Universal House of Justice for the period 1963 to 1986. I'll give the details below the video. There's also a useful background article which I wrote with Moojan Momen a few years back, covering the period 1957 to 1988 in terms of contemporary developments of that time in the Baha'i faith. In terms of context, I'll briefly mention some institutional developments, the World Crusade, Shoghi Effendi's passing and the absence of a will, the hands of the cause is custodianship, and the success of the World Crusade. Obviously, I could talk about this in much more detail, but it's going to be a very, very brief summary. In terms of institutional developments, two major periods of institutional change under Shoghi Effendi. First of all, in the first 2 years of his guardianship from 1922 to 23, he regularized and encouraged the establishment of locally and nationally elected Baha'i councils, the spiritual assemblies, throughout the Baha'i world. Then, from 1950 to 57, he established the International Baha'i Council in 1950, revived the institution of the Hands of the Cause in 51, and established the auxiliary boards to assist the hands in two separate boards, one in 54, one in 57. I go into more detail on these matters in the relevant entries in my Concise Encyclopedia of the Baha'i faith. So look up the entries on the administration, assemblies, auxiliary boards, Hands of the Cause, and the International Baha'i Council. In 1953, Shoghi Effendi launched a major plan for global Baha'i expansion, and it was brought to completion under the custodianship of the Hands of the Cause in 1963. It provided the Baha'is with a clear set of goals for the development of the faith up to 1963. Just a few years into the 10-year crusade, however, Shoghi Effendi suddenly died. This was on the 4th of November 1957 during a visit to London. It was a major emotional shock for the Baha'is. The death was entirely unexpected. Shoghi Effendi himself was aged only 60, so still comparatively young. The shock was deepened when it was discovered that he'd left no will appointing a successor. This is his grave in North London, which some of you I'm sure are familiar with. Shoghi Effendi's unexpected death was a major crisis for the Baha'is, and for a moment or two they had really no idea what was going to happen next. Unable to find a will, the Hands of the Cause turned to Shoghi Effendi's messages, in particular his reference to them as the chief stewards of Baha'u'llah's embryonic world commonwealth. On that basis, they decided that they had the authority to make three major decisions. First, to continue the 10-year crusade to its completion as scheduled in 1963. Secondly, to change the International Baha'i Council, which Shoghi Effendi had appointed, into an elected body. That happened in 1961. And thirdly, to call for the election of the Universal House of Justice itself in 1963. Again, I go into more detail on these topics in my Concise Encyclopedia if you look at the entries on Hands of the Cause and International Baha'i Council. The 10-year crusade was itself extremely successful, and in terms of basic statistics, it saw an increase in the number of national spiritual assemblies from 12 in 1953 up to 56 in 1963. In terms of local spiritual assemblies, they increased from 670 to 4,437, and in terms of localities where Baha'is resided, the number went up from 2,700 to 14,437, all impressive gains. The crusade also saw the completion of 2 new Baha'i houses of worship in Kampala in Uganda and Sydney, Australia, the final completion of the Wilmette House of Worship in the USA, and work begun on the Frankfurt Temple in Germany, which was completed just 1 year after the crusade had ended in 1964. Again, I've gone into a little bit more detail on this in my articles on expansion and the Mashq Azkar in my Concise Encyclopedia, to which you're welcome to look. So that's all I'll say for the moment. As always, many thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without whom I wouldn't be able to make these videos. If you want to, please do like, comment and share on the videos. It really does help. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give a link to Patreon below in case you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll talk about the establishment of the Universal House of Justice. My apologies, by the way, for not as yet having begun work to prepare new videos for the history, social science track, but I've been ill for several weeks, so that's something for the future. Anyway, have a good day.